All right, then. Let's talk about these fights. My goodness. That was... It was like getting everything I wanted, but also really hating it. If you didn't see the fights this weekend, you didn't miss out on much. There were a couple of good ones, but Valentina Shevchenko turned in a boring performance, as she is oft willing to do. But I'm sure if you're here, you're either someone who loves me moaning at Valentina fans, or a Valentina fan who just wants to spank it while I tell them how shit she is. So we'll get onto that in a bit, but let's do some news. What's interesting? Ava Knight, who's a female boxing world champion, signed with Bellator, continuing their theme of hiring lady boxers because they're underpaid, and wrestlers because they aren't paid at all. It's pretty clever. You just pick them up because they're obviously talented. They have an element of fighting, which is they are more adept in than all these people who are actually doing well on the Bellator roster. And you see how they do. I mean, Heather Hardy's been a big hit for them. I don't know how she's doing at the moment, but she's fun to watch at least. What else is happening? They announced that Patricky Freire, the useless Pitbull brother, he had the same facial hair as Patricio at one point, and it appears on everyone else's highlight reels getting knocked out, and it looks like Patricio Freire is getting knocked out. In fact, when they finally do the rematch with Chandler for Patricio, they will use the footage of Patricky and they won't mention it's Patricky. I guarantee it. Because he starched Patricky and then he got run through by Patricio. But anyway, yeah, Patricky's going to Rising. Might be taking part in one of their tournaments. Can't remember what exactly he's doing there, but that's pretty cool, continuing that Rising Bellator overlap, even though Kyoji's really the workhorse of that partnership. Then some cool news, which is also kind of sad news. Nicholas Dalby's returning to the UFC. Did we do this last week? I can't recall. Nicholas Dalby's returning to the UFC against Alex Oliveira. Alex Oliveira, obviously a massive cheat. And Nicholas Dalby obviously cut a little bit early from the UFC and had that amazing bloodbath fight with, was it Ross Houston on Cage Warriors? Sad because we don't get the rematch. Glad because Nicholas Dalby's back in the UFC. And then on unexpected UFC returns, Mackenzie Dern has been booked to fight Amanda Ribas. Amanda Ribas is a strawweight. This fight is supposed to be at strawweight, or perhaps flyweight. Whatever the case, Mackenzie Dern is legendary for missing weight. Like last time, she missed weight by like 7 pounds. And the moment she got off the scale, because people filmed this, the moment she got off the scale, she walked over to the buffet. There's an actual buffet there to like refeed and rehydrate. And she just piled up a load of stuff, was smiling the whole time. She's like, sorry, I didn't make the weight. Yeah, she barely gives a fuck about her weight. This is even more hilarious because she had a baby 4 months ago. So, like, how are you going to lose baby weight and then do the weight cut if you couldn't do the weight cut already when you were training every day? Absolutely bonkers, but it's always great fun when she misses weight just because people absolutely lose their shit at her. And it's well deserved, she's actually making a mockery because, there are... Without getting into details, it's slightly more complicated for women to cut weight than men sometimes because of stuff. And, people, it just makes a mockery of all women doing weight cutting correctly when Mackenzie Dern's coming out and just fucking it all up. Actually, having said that, Aspen Ladd has now been indefinitely suspended by I think it's the California State Athletic Commission, wherever she fought Jermaine Durandamy, because she got up to like 157 or something ridiculous in the day after the weigh-in. And she was like shaking and seizing up on the scale. And then, obviously performed awfully in the fight. But it came out that she cut like 25% of her body weight, basically, or rehydrated 25% of her body weight. Just ludicrous. So they've given her a ban until she can prove that she's not doing that, which is not taking action against weight cutting specifically, but it is taking action against doing it like a fucking idiot. So let's get into the recaps, because, I'm looking forward to this, or I have been. What did I see on this card? I skipped a couple. Man, the first one that I remember actual details of was Rogerio Bontorin versus Ralian Paiva. That was gnarly. Dude got cut open pretty early on by like a snapping left. Was it right hook? I think it was his left eye. So yeah, his eye just got swolled up within seconds of this punch landing. He's pursuing the takedown. This is Bontorin. He's pursuing the takedown desperately. and then finally connects with like a punch and a knee and slices open Piva's basically the eyebrow. Basically, it was the Marvin Eastman cut. Joe Rogan wasn't there to say it was like a goat's vagina, but we were all thinking it. Properly nasty. The kind where it's getting down towards the bone. It's not just cutting your skin. So that was proper weird. And then I watched that one after I watched the Mike Perry one. So I was going, what the fuck is going on tonight? These faces just getting torn apart. Marina Rodriguez versus Tisha Torres. I mean, Tisha Torres, she's capable of having a fun fight. She just very rarely does. This was kind of dull. Marina Rodriguez was trying to fight long. Tisha Torres was spamming combinations, not really landing anything, ducking in on the hips, failing to get takedowns. Thought Rodriguez very much deserved the decision, but was concerned that Tisha Torres might get it. And then we get into the good stuff. Cyril Gane, my boy Cyril Gane, came in against Rafael Pessoa and showed you what Cyril Gane do. It wasn't a particularly convincing Cyril Gane performance. I mean, I got a lot of people hit me up saying, I'm so glad you told me about this guy. I wouldn't have watched these prelims otherwise. He was awesome. And I was going, didn't look as awesome as the last 2-3 times I saw him fight. Well, the other 2-3 times he fought. I mean, if you haven't read the Patreon piece, go read that. Become a Patreon boy, read the piece. But, he did all the switching and stuff. Didn't really get to work very effectively. He was quite conscious of the fact that Pessoa was going to try and time him with an overhand every time he came in. It's interesting because in his kickboxing career, he was obviously a lot lighter on the lead foot. He fought much more Muay Thai, and he fought very similar to like Tkachenko, where everything was inside low kicks and then moving in to hit knees in the clinch. That lead leg low kick would really help him out here. I thought, just something to put on the opponent from distance with less chance of getting hit with an overhand, and to actually set up entries. But no, he was busy bouncing around, he flicked him with a good few jabs, and they looked good, but that right hand he was throwing, I've seen him throw tight ones, but I've also seen him throw some booming overhands like that, but he was properly swinging into it and like leaning way off his stance and stuff, and I'm thinking, well, my first thought was, you training with Francis Ngannou, that's probably not going to go down well with him for a start, because, you're talking about a guy who his whole thing is sliding back with like a slapping left hook and trying to crack you with the right uppercut where his hand has just delivered your head to. So if you're doing that and you're diving with your head well off to the side and well forward of your center of gravity rather, you're making yourself a sucker for that. And then I thought, wait a minute, what if he's doing that because he's used to sparring with Francis Ngannou and he's trying to just throw these long fall-off overhands so that he's not still in range. He's really exaggerating it. Whatever the case, I did not like that much at all. I think he's much better when he's actually just making, getting in big on top of his feet and hitting them and not trying to punch without entering range. It's like when I was talking about Calvin Kattar versus Moicano. He was getting his lead leg kicked every time he stepped in. So then he started trying to invent a way mid-fight to land punches without stepping in, and it just doesn't work, throwing your body forwards of your feet, and you're just throwing yourself off balance, and even if you do hit, you're so off balance, you're probably not going to hurt him, and if you do, you're not going to be able to follow up effectively. However, Pessoa, I think he went for a trip, ended up getting reversed. It was like one of those cool lateral drop reverse through things, and ended up on the bottom, and Gane just grabbed an arm triangle. It looked like Pessoa was knackered for a start. He was exhausted from trying to time these overhands, basically, because he wasn't getting hit much. But you could see very early on in the round, like 2 minutes in, 3 minutes, well, what time did it finish? Yeah, like 4 minutes in. But like 2.5 minutes in, he was already puffing. And then he went for this effective trip, but then fell over the top and got arm triangle. And they were going, and he's going to submit a black belt. And I was like, well, you're not a black belt when you're knackered. You're just a guy at that point. So Bon Gammon, the big ham, makes his debut. Now, what is Bon Gammon? Isn't it like the good boy? I'm thinking of Gammon. Bon Gammon. He's bright red and he's always moaning about taking back Britain's sovereignty from the EU. No, what would the big ham actually be? Le Grand Jambon. There you go. He's the Grand Jambon whenever he fights from now on. The big ham, he gets his first UFC win, and he did excite some people, which is good, because that's what I was saying. We need some fucking excitement in the heavyweight division. I mean, we got the title fight next week. This weekend coming up, rather. But, him and Ngannou on their own, that camp, the two of them. Well, I mean, Ngannou's doing a lot more work out in Vegas now. But the two of them are providing more excitement for the division than almost anyone else at this point. Gilbert Burns versus Alexei Tkachenko. I mean, Gilbert Burns, when he said he was going up in weight, my first reaction was like, your striking's not great, and the harder it is for you to take people down, the stronger they are, the bigger they are, the more your striking's going to be shown up, or you're going to be forced to use it, rather. And then Tkachenko, obviously not a joke. He was 20-0. He slapped around Thiago Alves, even though Alves is, well past his best at this point. But, yeah, I mean, this went about as you'd expect it to go. It was it started out with Gilbert Burns doing very well. Very nice low kicks, doing things like that. Got a takedown. And was he on his back at the end of the first round? I can't recall, but he was doing very well through like the first round and then into the second round, and then he just sort of slowed down. Tkachenko managed to drop him with a couple of low kicks. And yeah, I mean, Burns got the decision. I wasn't angry about it, but it wasn't, it left me with more questions than it did answers at that point. I was like, that's not the most, glamorous way to announce your arrival in the welterweight division when you consider all the killers that are there. What else did I see that was good? Oh, Rodolfo Vieira. No, he's not Mutante. He's, Demente. Demente? The madman. But Rodolfo Vieira, successful UFC debut. At middleweight, Michael Bisping being like, yes, look at him, he's an absolute tank. That's what years of grappling will do to your body. And I was like, grappling and chemistry. Actually started out really well with a jab, and his jab looked quite good. It was just coming straight from the shoulder. It didn't have any telegraph on it, and he seemed surprised it was landing as much as Pichota seemed surprised that it was landing. But Pichota, I mean, I underrated him coming into this because, like, people hit me up and they were like, "Oh no, he actually submitted Calasanz in ADCC and things like that." Actually very legit on the ground. And you saw that with like Rodolfo would get him down, he'd do that thing where he's pressuring into the butterfly guard along the fence, and he wasn't really doing anything with it for much of the fight. There's actually a really nice inversion from Pichota at one point where Rodolfo was sort of pressuring past his guard. He turned over. Michael Bisping was convinced that Rodolfo had his back, but he was actually just flopped back into half guard on the other side, which was pretty cool. It's kind of sad not seeing Rodolfo without the gi pants, because he'd just take the gi grips, kick his leg free from whatever guard you're using, and then just run round you back and forth, throwing you by. It was an unstoppable force in heavyweight jiu-jitsu. But, he's going to have the same problem as everyone else. He's going to have the same problem as Galvao, is what I'm predicting, because Galvao's jiu-jitsu is god tier, but even in jiu-jitsu you have styles and preferences, and Galvao was a top player. He was a incredible guard passer. He had a good guard too, but, you certainly saw it a lot more in the gi than you saw it in no-gi. No-gi, he'd get into like stalling matches on the feet with Huzumar Palhares and things like that. But his whole thing was being an incredible top player. His MMA career hit the skids when in Strikeforce they matched him up against a young Tyron Woodley, obviously coming off an incredible wrestling career and having established himself as a dude with heavy hands. And Galvao just kept shooting. Woodley would sprawl on him and try and uppercut him on the way out. And Galvao didn't really have any answers for it. So you've either got to learn to wrestle pretty fucking sharpish. I mean, Damien Meyer's done an incredible job of learning to wrestle. But even then, you're probably better served learning to strike into your takedowns better. But I mean, I can see that really becoming a problem when he meets someone who can stuff his takedowns, and doesn't put themselves on the fence, when he starts pressuring them with a light jab. He's probably going to have a lot of problems. Maybe maybe not Dave Branch. Who would be tricky? I mean, Yoel Romero obviously would be tricky, but Yoel Romero is tricky for everyone who isn't. Well, he was even tricky for Whittaker. But actually, he's fighting next week. This weekend, rather. So that's fucking great. But yeah, not bad from Rodolfo, I thought. And again, I don't want to undersell what he was doing because the act of grappling was exhausting Pichota. By the end, Pichota was basically just giving up the arm triangle. He didn't really have any energy to try and scramble or pick his legs up and grab around his knee and kick his shoulder away from his head. All the last chance arm triangle escapes that you go for, he was pretty much done by that point because the moment that Rodolfo dismounted, basically you've got a small window if you're caught in a bad arm triangle where the moment they dismount, and this is why a lot of guys don't dismount now, or try and wait as long as possible before they dismount. When you dismount, that's when when they dismount, you've got to like kick your legs up, grab behind them, pull your shoulder away from your head, or turn your like basically Kimura yourself with the arm that's caught in and try and turn away. But it all has to happen the moment they dismount, basically, because the moment they settle on your side, you're pretty much done. And Peixoto didn't make it happen as soon as Rodolfo dismounted. He looked pretty tired. So as much as we can say like he wasn't as effective as we thought he'd be, we expected him to just slice through like butter in his first UFC fight. It worked. He wasn't hurt. He wasn't really troubled that much. It just took him longer than expected. But fun enough. I look forward to his next fight in the UFC. He's a little bit like... I was saying this to someone on Facebook. We were talking about... firstly, his incredible victory over USADA to get here. Because you saw him in this fight. He was a tank, but he used to be even bigger. Like he was when he was heavyweight in jiu-jitsu. He was monstrous. But I was just remembering Robert Drysdale, who I was very excited to see come to the UFC, because he won ADCC, and I think he's sort of like he'd been on the tournament scene for a long time, but hadn't really won the big titles, and he finally won ADCC. And basically his thing was like, I'm going to jump to MMA now, because he'd been training these guys like Forrest Griffin and so on for years. And then he had some fights, beat them all, beat all his opponents, came to the UFC, didn't get a fight because he failed 2 separate drug tests while waiting for a fight to happen. And this is when they weren't using USADA or actually running an effective testing protocol. He was failing like urine tests before fights. It was incredible. And I'm still so butthurt that we never got to see him in the cage, in the UFC at least. The more top-tier grapplers we get, the better. Eduardo Garagori versus Humberto Bandenet. We said before this, turns out he's Uruguayan, not Argentinian. There's my reading of flags going wrong. But Garagori, obviously huge pop. Crowd were so into him because he was the only Uruguayan fighter on the card. Obviously they didn't build this card around him because he was a debuting fighter, and by the outcome you can say like he wasn't super special. But these lads had a good back and forth. I thought, it was exciting enough, but I was sort of just like, it didn't feel, it was another one of those where, maybe if I was scoring it along with it, I'd have given it cleanly to Garagori, but at the end I was like, I don't mind who wins that one. Let's talk about the good stuff. Volkan Oezdemir, performance of the night, in my humble opinion. I thought he looked tremendous here, because, Ilir Latifi, it's very easy to say that he's limited, and he just does the takedowns and the booming hooks. But those two things play into each other, and he's incredibly dangerous. Oezdemir, when he went into his title shot, I was very skeptical, because basically the 2 fights that actually got him attention, who was it? It was Jimmy Manuwa and Misha Serkinov. Those 2 fights, he got the reputation for booping people inside seconds, but he just spazzed out at them. Like, they got to a clinch and he spazzed out in a way that you wouldn't advise anyone to do, because they get tired doing something which very rarely pays off. Luckily, Misha Serkinov has a habit of just falling down randomly, and Jimmy Manuwa has always been chinny and susceptible to early pressure. But having seen him in his last 2, Volkan Oezdemir, he's looked really sharp. And he didn't even look bad in the Cormier fight, I thought. And there was a little bit of the Cormier fight in this one. He came out with the lead hand quite low, and he was trying to flick it up for hooks and then drop it down for the underhook again. So he was leading with the left hook or leading with a left uppercut even. He was also throwing the right straight as he stepped back with his right foot. If you can throw the right straight going backwards, that's a cracking punch. Roy Jones did it well, but usually used it to set up his left hook. Muhammad Ali did it pretty well. Jimmy Ellis, who was Muhammad Ali's training partner and won the WBA, their heavyweight tournament when Muhammad Ali was in exile. They had a tournament and they invited the top 10 heavyweights in the world. 8 of them were put into the tournament. Only one, the only one to turn it down basically was Joe Frazier, who Joe Frazier and I think Buster Mathis. Buster Mathis was like number 11 or something like that, and Joe Frazier was number 1. He was like, fuck that, I'll wait for the winner. But Jimmy Ellis ran through that tournament by basically hitting people with right hands while he dropped away from them. Excellent skill if you can do it. And just the volume that Oezdemir was using, nice low kicks, didn't go to him too often, but I think that was a good idea. Why risk getting bundled over by this guy who's getting desperate, just chop him in when you can, and that's another thing that he has to worry about. Good knees, used even like jumping knees. If you get your man to the fence and you know he's probably going to shoot, might as well try and come up the center. Luque did this in the co-main. He does this a lot. I didn't put it in the Filthy Casuals guide, but he does the same thing that Mittel Grodenhart does when you get them near the boundary. Try the jumping double knee. Especially in MMA because you've got a higher chance of them ducking in on your hips, whereas that's not going to happen in kickboxing. Takedown defense was absolute money, really on point. We said that obviously he had that fight with Dominic Reyes and he was defending he was grappling well. There was some good scrambly stuff in that, but obviously Dominic Reyes isn't known as a takedown artist, whereas Ilir Latifi is. That's his thing. But yeah, just brilliant. And that's where you saw Volkan Oezdemir at his absolute best. Don't focus on like knocking the guy out. Focus on scoring points, because he was like a minute into round one, maybe 2 minutes into round one. Ilir Latifi's face was already busted up and he was looking really disheartened, because if you are 205 pounds, in fact, if you're smaller than 205 pounds and you actually have good technique and you move your hips well and your feet well, you don't have to load up. If you're just focusing on landing punches whenever you can and winning points, call them points if you want. If you're scoring points and you're actually doing it with good technique, you're probably going to be hurting them. Certainly tiring them out. And there were some good body shots. He hit a nice right knee coming out of a clinch that had Latifi like doubling over, and he finally knocked him down with a left hook and finished him on the ground. This is a guy who a little while ago I was like, I cannot be asked to write about him versus Daniel Cormier. Now his last two performances I've been like, well, this guy is actually looking like a good all-round fighter at light heavyweight. Crazy, eh? And even against Daniel Cormier, mind you, Daniel Cormier wasn't just picking up the long distance snatch singles / high crotch head outside single, whatever you want to call it. Snatch singles is something we're going to talk about. Well, I was planning on doing maybe a Daniel Cormier Filthy Casual guide this week, but snatching singles from out in the open, and by that I mean anything where you're not like having to hit a penetration step or really closing on the opponent, where you're reaching out for the leg, those actually work pretty well in MMA because guys are in a much sturdier stance. They're not there with their head out in front and ready to, on balls of both feet, ready to pull one leg back. Weidman does it a lot. Cormier does it a lot. Different types of snatch single, but reaching out and picking the leg up, pulling it into you. And Frankie Edgar's thing, where he posts on the shoulder and drives them back and picks the leg up. That's the same thing. You're not putting yourself underneath the opponent's weight. You're never going to get sprawled on when you're just reaching for their leg. The worst that's going to happen is they're going to pull their leg back. But yeah, that wasn't working for Daniel Cormier against Volkan Oezdemir. He really actually had to do clever stuff and set up his entries. And he set it up by checking both hands and establishing the jab really well. And then encouraging Volkan Oezdemir to take underhooks whenever they came together. And then eventually got in that way. And that encouraging people... Well, we won't talk about this now. We'll talk about this later in the week. But that encouraging people to take underhooks is a new part of Daniel Cormier's game. And it's working really well for him. Because if Daniel Cormier closes in on you, you're going to keep your elbows tight, even if you're worried about him hitting you in the face. You're more concerned about giving the Olympian a body lock or an underhook. So he gives guys underhooks now. And then as they go, okay, I'm just going to drop away and release these underhooks, he keeps the grip behind the head and either ducks in on the high crotch as he did against Oezdemir, or hits an uppercut or a right hook as he did against Stipe. I said I wouldn't talk about that now, but I did. Luque versus Mike Perry was good fun, I thought. Some people were telling me this was like the fight of the year, and I was going, really? Grisly result. All actional. It seemed weird. The crowd seemed a bit numb to it. They just blew their load cheering Garagori earlier, but this was one of the more exciting fights, probably the most exciting fight on the card. And they just didn't seem to care. It was really interesting because you got Mike Perry, who is quite tricky when he wants to be. You saw exactly the same thing I've always talked about with Mike Perry. He hit that step up inside low kick, and he was catching Luque with it. And Luque was having to pick up his leg and adapt, and it was letting Mike Perry get in easier. And then he just he abandoned it completely. It was working well, and he threw a high kick off it at one point. He threw a step up left low kick, put it down behind him, and then threw a southpaw left high kick. And when Mike Perry does that stuff, that's a lot more to think about. If you're standing in front of Mike Perry and he's just moving his head and grimacing, that he's going to throw the one jab on its own, or he's going to throw a right hook or a left hook or something like that. He's going to try and punch you with a big punch. Once he's kicking your leg, you actually have something to think about, and then he can get in on you easier. And it's very, really obvious at this point now when Mike Perry's not doing like the exaggerated Tyson head movement, which doesn't really serve much of a purpose a lot of the time. When he's not doing that, it's so obvious how much he tenses up before he steps in. It's like he's in a relaxed fighting stance, and then everything just clamps itself into position as he steps in on the opponent, and then he throws the punch. Whereas Luque was coming straight from his guard. Luque had the problems that we predicted with just standing tall and covering up, because he does that a lot. That's his thing. He doesn't have evasions, he just has cover and counter. And obviously that bloodied Perry up. He's hitting him with counter left hooks and things. But, if you're dealing with a puncher as heavy as Mike Perry, you probably want to be getting away from those punches and then countering rather than covering and throwing back. But then Luque's used to being the bigger puncher whenever he fights, and being able to take more than the opponent. And this time he was fighting a guy who just takes punches really well and throws really hard. Perry hit a wicked Mike Tyson style deep slip to the left and then come up with the left up jab, lancing forward left uppercut. That was beautiful. But the knee that spread Perry's nose all over his face, you could tell that really hurt him, because at the end of the fight, they stood up, and I'd forgotten about the knee altogether, and I went, fucking hell, at Mike Perry's nose, as all the crowd did. And then he went back and realized, that splintered his nose all over his face, that knee, and he immediately took Luque down and didn't let him up, because he was probably in blinding pain. Fighters generally, a lot of them get their nose broken, and it becomes like a repeat issue for them, to the point where it's just like if you have a shoulder or something that pops out of place, and you just go, fuck it, I've got to put that back in. I suspect the more it happens, the more used to it you get. Maybe it doesn't hurt less, but you feel it less. But that one was horrible. You could tell that he was in an awful lot of pain. People said he was robbed. I don't know if he was, but I thought it was a really good fight. I think it really does show you that the atmosphere of the crowd can add to fights and detract from them. I thought the crowd almost not responding to these guys beating lumps out of each other really killed it. But then they redeemed themselves by not responding to the main event, and that was incredible. Michael Bisping being like, the crowd know that at any moment Valentina could explode. Like, really? There's fucking Valentina fanboys at home jacking it, going, oh god, Michael, tell me about how she's going to explode. It's just so bad. People blaming Liz Carmouche. This is the funniest. The fucking double standards with Valentina Shevchenko. It was Liz Carmouche's job to bring it to the champion, while simultaneously believing that Valentina Shevchenko won the second Nunes fight, in which she didn't take it to the champion at all, and nothing happened. This is the thing that, Valentina Shevchenko, everyone wants to, if you're calling her a killer, you're an idiot. We've already established that ages ago. But people have her down as like this amazing all-rounder who can do everything, and it's just not true. She's a counterfighter who can only counterfight, really. She was offensive against Priscilla Cachoeira, but even then she was like, I'm not keeping it on the feet, even though they picked out this scrub for her to counterpunch the shit out of. She went straight at her and took her down instead. Valentina Shevchenko is basically female Anderson Silva with less finishing ability. If the opponent doesn't lead, and lead really aggressively, she ain't doing shit. And that's fine. That is fine. But to me, this was like when I said that Conor McGregor was a more versatile counterfighter than Anderson Silva or something like that. Oh no, versatile striker, I think I said it was. Because he goes forward, he's aggressive, but in order to get on the counter. That is a comprehensive fighting style, or striking style at least. You go forward attacking. If they're not going to fire back at you, they're going to get attacked. They're going to get beat up. When they do fire back at you, they're going to make mistakes because they're under pressure. The Anderson Silva style of sit back, and if they charge at you, you're going to knock them out. If they don't, you may, you outpoint them based on being the champion. That just, that isn't a comprehensive style. If you look bad whenever the opponent doesn't do anything, that's not a comprehensive style of striking. No one's perfect, no one's great at everything, but I feel like you at least want those two aspects, and Shevchenko doesn't have it. She just doesn't go forward. If you could find fighters as bad and willing to throw themselves into it as Jessica Eye for every one of her opponents, I'm sure she'd get a lot more finishes. But Liz Carmouche, while bad, just wasn't having it. How much do you want me to gloat about this fight? Because it's not particularly rewarding. It's just hilarious that people made her into this thing that she isn't. And, maybe next time they match her up against God, who's an absolute scrub in the... well, who isn't? No, who's bad in the flyweight division that they can match her up against, and maybe she gets a finish. And then people will go, well, it was clearly an off night against Liz Carmouche. And you go, check out her other fights, mate. It's weird. The obsession with Valentina Shevchenko is weird. Oh, the best one is... every time someone commented me when I was laughing about this during the week, it was like, let's not forget that she took Nunes to a decision even though she was smaller, which I think should count as a win. And then you're like, in the same breath, they're telling you how she beat Joanna Jędrzejczyk, coming up in weight to the division created for Valentina Shevchenko. Oh, it's maddening, these people. They are just so blinded by the belief that if you say positive things about Shevchenko enough, she might read them and then touch your willy. Anyway, I'm so fucking glad that those fights are over. Let's do some questions. Hi, Jack. I was wondering if you could discuss in more detail the safety lead / jab that you mentioned in your GSP and Bisping articles, and I'm sure elsewhere. I myself have found achieving this dominant inside angle using the safety lead to be my only way of landing power shots to the head with any consistency. I usually set it up by following my opponent's right hand back into their guard, sometimes with a double jab, though I'm not sure if this would be considered a separate technique. I would really love to hear more about fighters from any discipline who use this technique, fights it featured prominently in, techniques it pairs well with, and how to mitigate the danger best, etc., etc. Any thoughts appreciated? Thanks from Josh. Safety lead, I don't really get to talk about it at the moment much because there's not really many people doing it. Safety lead is a term that I stole from Edwin Hazlett. Edwin Hazlett called the jab while stepping to the left and forward slightly. So basically circling around to your left while jabbing. He called that the safety lead. And he really liked to have the lead foot and knee pointed in and the lead shoulder up tight. So basically, he considered it like getting down behind your lead shoulder, being in almost a shoulder roll position, but jabbing at the same time. So he considered it a very safe position. You're moving, I suppose, towards the opponent's right hand, kind of past it. But the idea is that the lead shoulder's there, so when you see that right hand coming back, you just get down behind the right shoulder, and then you fire back the right hand or whatever. It's a nice position to put you into a counter-punching position, but it's also a nice position to follow with the right hand just anyway. If they're not throwing, you can throw the right hand down the center, because if you get slightly off, when you're lined up with someone boxing, normally your left shoulder is like down their sternum, and their left shoulder is lined up down your sternum, and your lead feet are next to each other. It's not like but you slot in nicely, whereas in a southpaw versus orthodox engagement, the lead foot of both of you is like a barrier, your lead knee in the way. If you're fighting someone who's covering up or whatever, when you throw the safety lead, you're stepping to your left with the jab, and they bring their gloves up. You can step offline and line up your right shoulder with their center line and then throw it straight down the center. Think of like Mark Hunt's left hook into right straight. He'd throw that slapping left hook while stepping slightly off to the right, to his left side and throwing that shorter right straight. So he's throwing the right straight in front of his right shoulder, not straight to his center line. When you're doing your shadow boxing or you're learning or whatever, or you're standing straight in front of the bag, you're throwing 1, 2, and your punches both go to the center. Whereas when you safety lead off, you step off to your left with a jab, and you want to throw the right hand, your right hand goes straight down the center from your right shoulder because you've placed your opponent's head in front of your right shoulder instead of in front of you directly, if any of that made sense. Now, one of the things that I like about the safety lead, and one of the ways that it was used by GSP, he'd use the left jab stepping off to the left, but then he'd use the left jab stepping off to the left and step his right foot up and throw a left inside low kick. And because of the angle, he'd almost turn like away from his opponent so that the left kick almost came up behind their lead leg, like into the back of their knee. That's one of my favorites. And that's a big Kyokushin thing. They really like to step round to the left, skip up into their leg, and basically almost turn away from the opponent while delivering that lead leg inside low kick into the like hamstring area. And GSP, obviously, I mean, if you haven't seen the primer video that I did ages ago, he used to use the jab circling off to the left and set up the low kick like that, and then he'd step round to his left and throw the high kick instead, and he knocked down Shields and Hughes with that. Couple of examples of guys who used the safety lead a lot. Sugar Ray Robinson, everything he did was like jabbing around to his left behind his lead shoulder, ready to come back with left hooks and things like that. Roberto Duran's always one of my favourites to show like how to use the jab to instigate counter-punching exchanges. So every jab he threw, it was like he was already moving for the counter-punch, whether it came or not, as in for the opponent's counter-punch, that is. So he'd jab and like slip to his left, which I'm sure everyone does when they go in the gym, because like that was a Tyson thing. He'd jab and then he'd slip to the left immediately. He'd jab when he'd duck down, or jab and rather change level so that his head was about chest height. And that was basically like jab, and then if the opponent jabbed back, it would already be over his head, and he'd be slipping inside to throw the right hooks to the body. But then the other one he'd do was like jab and pivot round behind it. He'd basically do a safety lead and then do a pivot. So almost turning it back on the opponent, but getting down behind that lead shoulder. And if they throw at you in that pivot, you can then come back by stepping your left foot out again. You can come back with right straights from that position, or right uppercuts or whatever. Duran and Ray Robinson, probably the best ones to look at for safety leads. But it links in with stuff that Dominic Cruz was doing in his career too. He would step towards the opponent's right hand, but drive his left hand out and keep a little bit of range to set up like big right swings and things. It's a cool technique. We just don't really get to talk about it much because it's kind of a boxing centric technique, and especially like in those examples I gave, there's a lot of sort of getting almost 3/4 of the way around to showing them your back. I mean, not that, it's not quite that bad, but in the sport where guys can just slide down the side or pick up your leg and go to your back or whatever, it's a little bit more dangerous. Plus, generally in MMA, dudes aren't as comfortable staying in boxing range and throwing counters off counters. But I think as a platform for counterpunching, if you can learn to shoulder roll, and particularly in MMA, because you kind of, like, if you're going to use a shoulder roll in MMA, you really want to try and feed your opponent or force your opponent into predictable punching exchanges. Because if you're trying to like shoulder roll everything off at range and you're just giving them carte blanche and just giving them all the options in the world, they're going to start throwing high kicks and stuff. You can't predict what they're going to do. If you force them into a punching exchange by jabbing at them and stepping in on them and pressuring them, you've got a better chance of coming back with counters and less chance of getting head kicked. Anyway, cheers, Josh. Hey Jackie boy, quick question so I can shoehorn in a reference to Afro Samurai. Do you think there are many fighters who have been saved by very capable, though stylistically favourable, for the champ, gatekeepers one step below them, the number 2 headband, if you will? Examples come to mind like Aldo blocking Moicano, and Edgar from taking a crack at Holloway, at least initially, and Cormier retiring Johnson and taking care of Oezdemir, derailing any chance that they had at Jones in the short term. Thoughts? I mean, those were 2 of the examples I was going to say. Cormier taking Johnson out of the career, basically. I don't give... Anytime I let my rational brain think, I go, Johnson, if he gassed out against Cormier, how's he gonna not gas out against Jones, who's gonna lean on you, get to clinches, make you use some energy before he even starts engaging you? But then my Neanderthal brain goes, but I want to watch Rumble knock him out. But yeah, I mean, guys like Johnson and Oezdemir, no one's even going to talk about Oezdemir versus Jones. Even now, Özdemir's doing really well against very capable opponents. No one's really talking about him versus Jones, despite being a very skilled all-rounder. And the thing that, he's showing he's a very skilled all-rounder in very skilled all-around fights with guys like Dominic Reyes, who's supposed to be like the next hope at beating Jones. So yeah, I think that's definitely hurt his career, or hurt his path to the top. Prospect killer Aldo is a pretty good example, but I was thinking that Joanna Jędrzejczyk was going to get into a very weird position. I think, by giving her that Valentina fight, or asking her to take that Valentina fight, or getting her boob implants so that she can't make 115 again, I think they really dodged a bullet with that situation, because that could have got very weird, because you had this situation where even from the moment that Rose won the title, I was like, there are some horrible matchups for her here that Jędrzejczyk dealt with, but I think Rose will always be a horrible matchup for Jędrzejczyk. And you could have got into that position where people really need a clear number one, even if it's not actually as clear cut as that. I think it's very rare that the number one in the world would actually not have any trouble with any of the other like top 10, but people need to think that to actually get behind like the unbeatable champion and all that. And I think you would have had a real hard time selling that with a round robin of like Jędrzejczyk, Namajunas, Andrade, Jędrzejczyk, because right now we could be right back at at Jędrzejczyk having another title shot at Jessica Andrade, and all it would take would be Rose Namajunas winning a couple of fights and being right back in there. I'm sure there are some other great examples. I'm struggling to think of them in the short term, but definitely, I mean, I can think of plenty of examples of guys who, maybe not one stylistic gatekeeper who's keeping them out, but who just couldn't get the wins together, and you thought that maybe they had something for the champion, specifically in their odd style. You know, I thought Michael Bisping for a long time. I was like, okay, well, he's got this weird volume punching style. He's learning to use feints and jabs better. Well, he's beaten like Belcher and people, or maybe a little bit before that. But he just can't get the wins together. You know, guys like monsters like Vitor Belfort or Luke Rockhold would just knock him off track. But it was interesting thinking about him versus Silva, and then when they met, I mean, granted both were much older, but you saw a lot of that play off in the styles. You know, his style is very difficult for Anderson Silva's lean back and counterpunch style to deal with, because he's doing so much at any given time and throwing lots of feints and throwing out static, you know, scrambling the signal. But then we're getting into like, you know, that's less like one guy throwing them off course than, oh, if this guy just had one other skill in MMA. You know, it's all very well and good that being like, oh, if we could just get this current D1 champion in with Tyron Woodley when he was the champion or whatever, he'd probably take care of him in the wrestling, but he just can't actually get past people who can strike and grapple. But if you have any interesting ones, throw them up in the comments, because or email me them or whatever, because I'd love to read about next week. I'm sure there's plenty of weird examples. There's all sorts of like what ifs. I mean, like Chuck and Vandy in the final of the Pride tournament, you know, because Rampage just beat the shit out of Chuck. We never got that fight until like 2008 when they're both very much past it. Anyway, cheers, John. Dear Jack, you have sometimes mentioned what certain fighters could add to their game to become significantly better, such as dirty boxing Ben Askren. That's a mythical creature if ever I've heard of one. As our good friend Gunnar Nelson has a fight coming up and seems to either win in exciting fashion or lose by this decision in slower fights where he doesn't get a lot of offense going, we will never accept that Pons loss fully. What tricks could he have up his sleeve to beat Leon Edwards and or Maia that might help him going forwards? Or that might help him going forward? Sincerely, from Iceland. Okay. Yeah, Nelson's an interesting one. I think Nelson is a perfect example of one of those guys where you see their style and you go, those two things synergize beautifully. You know, the striking goes into the takedown and the takedown sets up the striking. But there are some of those where you go, yeah, you know, if the takedown's not working, he strikes, and if the striking's not working, he hits the takedown. But there are some of those where you go, if one's not working, the other's not working either. And Gunnar Nelson is absolutely one of those. When he can't take guys down, he has to spend longer in the striking. And his striking is, I don't want to say fast twitch because I hate that expression, but fast twitch. No, his striking is very up on the balls of the feet, feinting, burst in, you know, it's real speed reliant stuff. Like Kyoji Horiguchi, but Kyoji takes lots of breaks, circles the cage, measures himself, you know, whereas Gunnar Nelson, especially against like Rick Story and people like that who walked him down, you know, the more you make him do, the tireder he gets, the less effective he gets on the feet. And, you know, his takedowns aren't, the success of Gunnar Nelson's takedowns, and this was the very first Filthy Casuals guide that we did, and I was saying I think this will be hard to do against Leon Edwards, but the success of his takedowns was scoring the right hand and going straight through into them. The right hand straight into double underhooks, just like Fedor, or right hand straight through into like that short double leg, the Marotte Gary double hand reap. You know, that is a takedown that isn't your wrestling ability, that's you being in such good position off your punch that it's very difficult for them to stop you because they're still in that striking mode. When you watch them against like Rick Story, who didn't really care about being hit in the head and just dropped his hips as soon as Gunnar Nelson got in on him, it was a lot harder, and he got forced to stand a lot longer. And Story also great with the body shots, really committed to it in that fight, tired Nelson out. Damian Maia obviously just got into a pure grappling match with a guy who was, you know, levels above him. There's no quick solution to Damian Maia rolling all over you. I think a lot of it was, he probably could have helped himself if he wasn't looking for the guillotine all the time, because even like Kavanagh, he was shouting or saying in the corner, just keep looking for that guillotine. You know, it's having that one thing that you're relying on, but the guillotine is such a, you know, you're committing to it. Especially if you're like rolling to your back to try it. There, you know, if you've got a good grip on it and you can crunch them over, you can use it to sweep and stuff. But it's still bringing them closer into you. Whereas I think with Maia, you want to be just working on scrambling away, creating distance as much as possible, and not fucking around trying to counter-submit him. But I think if I had to add anything to Gunnar Nelson, or if I could add anything to Gunnar Nelson, I think a lot more picking and annoying striking. His everything is just bursting on the right hand, and it's that karate style Iken Hisatsu, one hit, certain death. And it's a great philosophy to train with if you're doing your traditional martial arts, but it doesn't actually hold up once you punch someone in the head and they're still there. I think you need to add like a flicking jab like Gane is using, and Kyoji even has a fairly decent jab. And Kyoji also uses his right hand. He uses like a 1-2 to enter, and he'll weave into the left hook, and that just is building a combination of that. I think a jab and an inside low kick could go a long way for Nelson. I don't see him being a guy who gets to the body and just works guys over rounds, because it's such a labor-intensive striking style that he has, or a conditioning-intensive striking style. Conditioning-intensive? Whatever. It just uses a lot of energy. That being said, when I see guys who can get to the clinch well, because he goes right hand into the clinch, and if they drop their hips back, he snatches the double collar tie immediately. And that's, it's hard against guys like Rick Story, who are immediately going to stand bolt upright and try and punch your body, or drop your hips back and stop, kill your underhooks. But he can get a hold of people. It's just converting those into takedowns. If you can get a hold of people, I'd love to see him move them to the fence and try and work the body more. Post the head in front of theirs. I mean, obviously that's hard if you're dealing with head post God Leon Edwards, but post the head in front of theirs, start kneeing the body. If you can post the head, get your hands free and just hit the body as they circle out. I think the more dudes who start doing that, the better, because you're using your ring positioning to set up a free flurry. And you might catch them with like a left hook to the body, right hook to the body, left hook to the head. You might knock them down on the way out. But more importantly, you're taking something out of them while you're failing to take them down. But I think jab, inside low kick, low kick with the right leg, those would all be fantastic for him. He just needs to learn to actually have stuff out in the open. He used to do a step-up left kick to the body. He still does that occasionally, or a left high kick. He still does an occasional side kick. But these, again, like, when you watch him throw them, it's like stomp on the opponent's guts, and you throw it like once a fight, and it's a real, like, I'm going to end the fight with this side kick to the body. I think he needs to learn a kickboxing game to make do between the big rushes. And I think that's true of everyone who tries to apply this point fighting style in MMA. I think you've got to learn how to box off it, how to kickbox off it. Like Rob Whittaker, he'll bounce into big bursts and things, but he'll also just do a little bit of bouncing to set up a nice jab. He'll land jabs to set up the big bouncing stuff later. It's fitting that very, like I said, labor-intensive game into a more economical kickboxing, boxing style fight. Because point fighting bouts are like 2 minutes long, whereas kickboxing bouts are 3-3-minute rounds, 5 3-minute rounds, 5 2-minute rounds. They depend whatever kickboxing style you're doing, but it's longer. Boxing is, up to 10 to 12. 12 of you are going for a world title, but 3-minute rounds. So, you have to be able to keep it going through the rounds. Whereas Gunnar Nelson's style, it doesn't seem to work after like round 2. Anyway, cheers, Iceland. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today. We'll be back later in the week to talk about UFC 241. Is it 241? Yeah, we got Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic. We got Nate Diaz. Fucking hell, I didn't even realize he was on the card. Versus Anthony Pettis, but I expect that'll fall through during the week because that's how these things do. We got Yoel Romero versus Paulo Costa, the Juicy Boys, getting it done. And we got a load of other interesting stuff too. So we'll talk about that. We'll have a Patreon preview coming. We'll have a Unibet piece coming. And I might even get in a Filthy Casuals guide. So I will catch you in the week. If you want to get in on the Patreon, read the Cyril Gane piece, the John Haggerty piece, the Martin Nguyen piece, all the stuff we're doing, the extra preview we're doing this week for UFC 241. Do that. We need your support for the podcast. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebipodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing at any time, because I can't link Unibet pieces on YouTube without being told off for encouraging children to gamble, though it was fine when those CSGO people were doing it, fightprimer.com. I'm your boy, Jack Slack, greasing up your hog to a Valentina Shevchenko stall fest. Bless.